lightly over the land and rustled the lush trees and vegetation that filled the area. Flowers were in full bloom, for the month of Ramlia, the summer month, had come. The beautiful land was a far cry from the marauder-infested wastes to the south, a veritable strip of Eden sandwiched between the sea and destruction. In spite of the fact that the world was bustling with life around them, the inhabitants of Black Knight Base 21 were in mourning. They had lost 2 members of Sentry Squad, a famously elite team of fighters. They found no bodies, and though they waited the customary 90 days for them to return, Crinnan Jamiso and Jeff Skaven were ultimately pronounced MIA and presumed dead.
"He was a good soldier,"
Captain Bran, the hulking, white-haired, and single-eyed Gaian, announced to the crowd of mourners that stood before him. His voice rang out over the silence like the love child of gravel and thunder.
"Crinnan was young, quiet. He was strong. The boy had his life ahead of him. It is truly a shame that we lost him the way we did."
Behind Bran was a stone altar with a flame burning on top of it. Crinnan's sword and chest piece rested at the foot of the altar. His sword had been found in the Belhazi Weld. His armor had been left behind in the Isla Oxy caverns. The mourners looked on with faces that were mostly devoid of emotion. They had all grown accustomed to death, numb to it. Only those that were close to Crinnan showed visible signs of pain.
"I wish there was more we could have done,"
Bran reflected as he lowered his head.
"I wish he could have continued the fight with us. I suppose the reality now is that he has given us another reason to fight. The reason being that his fight was never in vain, that his memory will live on."
A middle-aged human and dark-haired she-elf stood behind the towering Gaian captain. The man, Commander Crinnan Jamiso Sr., had his arm wrapped around his wife's shoulders. She stood silently with her arms crossed and head lowered. A furious look was painted onto her face.
"Commander Crinnan, Commander Ladia, would either of you like to say a few words?"
Bran asked, turning to the two. Commander Crinnan looked at his wife and squeezed her shoulder. He let go and stepped forward. Bran looked at Commander Crinnan, who stood a foot and a half below his eye level, and placed his massive hand on Crinnan's back.
"I'm sorry, old friend."
Crinnan nodded to him, and Bran stepped back and stood next to Ladia. Commander Crinnan stood for a moment and stared at the ground before him in silent deliberation. For 90 days, an entire month, he had exhausted his resources looking for his son. This wasn't the first time he had lost a child, and it was even more painful than the last. While he had not yet come to terms with the idea that any of his children were missing, he knew he had to be strong for the soldiers who looked up to him. He looked at the mourners before him, and they waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. Finally, with a sigh, he spoke. "What does a man say?" Commander Crinnan asked, his voice aged but smooth. "What does a man say at his son's funeral?" He bit his lip and nodded his head again. "As many of you know, Crinnan isn't the first child I've lost. My first daughter and eldest son both went missing long ago. Medea and I pray every night to any god who would hear us that they still breathe. While we may hold on to even the slightest shred of hope for them, I fear that my son Crinnan's fate is decided." He wiped a tear that he wasn't strong enough to hold back from his eye and cleared his throat. "Crinnan was very much like his mother," he said, and followed with a warm chuckle. "Kind of an asshole." The mourners laughed, for many of them knew of the younger Crinnan's reputation. He did not like to be looked at, touched, or spoken to, and he always had a sharp word or balled fist for most who tried. He always preferred to be left alone. Commander Crinnan looked back at his wife and saw that, however faint, a half-smile had momentarily formed on her face. He knew she would probably rip his ear off later for his comment, but making her smile was worth the lashing he would undoubtedly receive. "I remember when he was young," Commander Crinnan continued. "He was a little fireball. He would always get into fights with his elder siblings. Nobody was too big for him." Crinnan laughed as a memory popped in his mind. "Why, I remember one time I took his toy sword away because he kept hitting the dog with it. I told him we don't hurt things that aren't trying to hurt us, that it was our job to protect things weaker than us. The boy stood there and stared up at me, listening intently and nodding with every word of correction I offered. And when I asked him if he understood me, instead of nodding and acknowledging me like a good child, he reared back and punched me square in the dick. The mourners laughed again, and so did Crinnan. By the brothers, I loved that kid. Crinnan's face briefly wrinkled up with sadness. I will always love that kid. You see, behind that hard exterior, behind those walls that he built for himself, was the most beautiful heart. He felt so much harder and deeper than any of my other children. He experienced the world differently than the rest of us. He eventually protected animals from his brother Kirsten. He protected his twin brother from his brother Kirsten. He would always snuggle up in my or Lydia's arms at the end of the day after all his energy was spent. When we would kiss the top of that thick-haired head, he would try to burrow deeper. My son loved being loved. He hated showing love, though. But that is something I can forgive. Crinnan sighed deeply and looked out at everyone. While I have done my best, I have not always been there for my children, the commander admitted with sorrow in his voice. I wish things could have been different. Had I been able to be there to protect them, Sarah, Kirsten, had I been there with Crinnan, I would have given every breath I had to protect him. He sighed and tears fell down his face. It's why I fight this damned war. To make a better world for my children. It's why I cannot stop. Anger spread across his face for a moment, and he paused to compose himself. Another day, another death, right? He seethed, digging deep within himself to find the kind of words a leader needed to say. Another damn shard for Govia to dig up. This time it was my son. So what must a man do? Do I lay down? Submit? Do I give in to my sorrow and give up? Commander Crinnan trembled with fury and passion. His eyes were ablaze with fervor, and he swept his gaze over the assembled soldiers in front of him. As his lip curled into a snarl, he took a mighty step forward and pounded his fist against his chest. I will not! He began to speak faster and more furiously. The battle isn't any less won or any more lost with the death of my son or Jeff Skaven. We now have an even deeper responsibility to keep fighting. To win! We fight for true freedom. For those that hate us, we fight. For those who think they are already free, we fight. We fight for our sons, for our daughters and grandchildren, our husbands and wives. Because while mine has died, I would give my last breath to ensure yours lives. We fight for those fighting next to us and for those across the world who curse our name. We must never stop, even when, not if, we lose something or someone we love. My son died. Yes, and I will never forget that boy. And I will make damn sure that my sword cuts down 100 other fathers' sons if that's what it takes to free this world from Govia's grasp. The mourners nodded, and some clapped or cheered. Commander Crinnan turned to his wife and looked at her for a moment, and then back to the crowd. Today, we remember Jeff Skaven, and my son, and all the others who have fallen to protect our way of life. Today we mourn. Tomorrow, we pick up our swords again. We march forward, and in the famed words of the late great Commander Emilio Ibanez, we will take our power and wrap it around our enemies' necks. We will cut down every Govian who would dare think of getting in our way. Captain Brand stepped forward and pumped his massive fist into the air. For Crinnan! He bellowed, returning his thunderclap of a voice for all to hear. For Jeff Skaven! The mourners returned his shout with cheering of their own.